last couple of years, we have been bombarded with people in the mainstream media who claim to be experts in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The media, they have been begging us to give women's sports a chance. Now, if you're going to claim to be an expert, if you are going to beg people to give women's sports a chance, you better be sure you know what the hell you're talking about. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't know everything. Most of the time, I'm giving you guys my thoughts. I'm giving you guys my opinions. Now, it's an educated opinion. I read a lot about it, but it's still an opinion. But there are times when I share something with you guys that I know exactly what I'm talking about. For example, never buy betting picks from these so-called experts on the internet. You would be better off donating that money to a WNBA dump diver. At least they would put it to good use and use it for food or restocking the Just for Men. Now, if you're a regular gambler on sports, especially if you're doing it online, you're always bombarded with these advertisements from these so-called experts offering to sell you their insider information. Pay me $300 every month. I guarantee you a 3,000 unit return. Problem is, if you're a $100 per game bettor, you gotta win 3 bets just to break even. The so-called expert that you're paying, he's got to hit over 60% of his plays for you to make money. Long term, that is impossible. It is never going to happen. Over the last couple of years, ESPN, they have replaced most of their sports analysts, their sports experts. They have replaced them with personalities that represent diversity. Many of these replacements are women, and most of them are what the mainstream media likes to call women of color. Malika Andrews, Mina Kimes, Maria Taylor, who is now destroying the NFL pregame show every Sunday night on NBC. When she was at ESPN, Maria Taylor, she replaced a woman who was actually knowledgeable with the NBA, Rachel Nichols. Why? Diversity. Elle Duncan is another one of ESPN's prized diversity experts. Elle Duncan loves to promote women's sports. Ooh, I love March Madness. Women are better than men. I love the WNBA. When I'm feeling hot on a summer day, I watch the WNBA. There is no better cooling wind than the wind provided by a dump diver airballing a windmill dunk. Back in 2021, Elle Duncan was interviewed by someone who was writing for Medium. The title of the article was ESPN Rising Star Elle Duncan on the 5 things you need to shine in the entertainment industry. I mean, who better to ask than the expert Elle Duncan? Number 1 on her list was accuracy. Accuracy. It's kind of interesting considering the clip that I saw circulating on social media last night. Yesterday, Dawn Staley invited ESPN to one of her practices. ESPN, they decided to send 2 of their high-profile experts when it comes to women's sports, Elle Duncan and some other lady that no one's ever heard of. Now, Dawn Staley is a lot of things. She's a promoter of mythical racism. She's a promoter of mythical misogyny. She embraces a victim mentality. But I will give her credit for one thing. Dawn Staley is one hell of a basketball coach, arguably one of the greatest in the history of women's college basketball. The handful of people who follow women's college basketball, most of them would have Dawn Staley on their Mount Rushmore. Except, of course, Father Jalen Rose, the former lead pastor at Woke United Methodist. Father Jalen, he no longer uses the term Mount Rushmore. It's far too painful. He now uses the term Brokeback Mountain to highlight the people that he thinks are elite. But yesterday, Elle Duncan and Anonymous Alice, they are watching the Lady Cox participate in a scrimmage. Dawn Staley comes over to say hello and possibly discuss the most important issues in America today. Important issues like the lack of running water in the WNBA dump, the lack of media coverage that's given to women's sports. Even though there is more media coverage, more attention given to women's sports today than any other point in my lifetime, and for some reason, people still aren't watching. But before they could begin discussing these important issues, Elle Duncan, she had a question for Dawn Staley. She was incredibly confused. She was outraged. Her bosses at ESPN, they told her that she was going to watch women practice. But when she looked out at the court, Elle Duncan noticed that the gym had been overrun with toxic masculinity. Elle Duncan demanded to know What the hell was going on here? She asked Dawn Staley why there were cooties infiltrating the women's practice. Watch for yourself.
I'll be the ignorant one. I'm gonna address the elephant in the room. Who are these dudes?
These dudes are the highlighters.
Okay.
They're the highlighters because they actually are the main reason why we are as successful as we are. They're students. They're male practice players. They come here. They're committed. We win championships. They get rings.
I kind of feel like Dawn Staley was a bit thrown off by this question. As soon as she heard the question, Dawn Staley had this look on her face like, really? You're really having to ask me this question? Reason being, as an expert on women's sports, Elle Duncan should know better. Now, I'm not an expert on women's sports. I find most women's sports to be painfully boring. Why would I waste my time watching Megan Rapinoe when I can watch real soccer? Why would I want to watch trashketball in the WNBA when I could just watch real basketball in the NBA or at the high school level? Now, I'm not an expert in women's sports, but even I knew the reason why Dawn Staley had her team practicing against dudes. I was already aware of the fact that women's teams across the country, they often scrimmage against men. My girlfriend's daughter, she plays soccer at the high school level. She plays soccer, she plays flag football. Hell, she's involved in damn near everything at that school. But about once a week during the season, her soccer coach, he will organize a practice with the boys' team. Now, if you were to judge both teams based solely on their records, you would think that the girls' team was superior to the boys. But her coach, he doesn't organize these practices so they can help the boys get better. These practices are put together to help the girls get better. The only way for you to get better at something is to compete against people that are superior to you. It's the reason AHL players will sometimes practice with NHL players. They are trying to develop their skills, their game, so they can make it to the next level. What's the best way to do that? You practice against people who are already at that level. Makes sense, right? But this clip, I thought this clip was interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, Dawn Staley claims to be all about diversity, but when I looked at the dudes on that court, I didn't see any diversity. I saw 4 white dudes on the court, I saw 5 white dudes on the bench, but I only saw 1 black player. That doesn't seem very diverse to me. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation for this. Maybe there weren't any minority dudes available because they're all on the real men's basketball team. But the second reason I thought this was interesting, Dawn Staley is basically admitting this without saying it, but her actions tell you all you need to know. Dawn Staley is basically admitting that the athletic competition she would get from females is subpar. It's no good. During training camp, NFL teams will often scrimmage with other NFL teams. NBA teams scrimmage against each other. Men's college basketball teams, same thing, they scrimmage against each other. How come Dawn Staley isn't organizing a scrimmage with other teams in women's college basketball? I mean, you heard her say it. The dudes are the reason her team is winning championships. The dudes are the reason her ladies are getting better. They're improving. Unintentionally, Dawn Staley just disproved the false notion that is often presented by ESPN that women are equivalent to men. Now, I would imagine that's part of the reason that Elle Duncan was so surprised. Elle Duncan views everything through the prism of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In her mind, men and women, they are equal athletically. So why would a women's team be practicing against the men? Doesn't make sense to her. But this is proof that diversity and equity are absolute myths. If Dawn Staley really believed in diversity, she would be practicing her team against other women's teams. But at the end of the day, Dawn Staley only cares about one thing: winning. That's what she is paid to do: win. South Carolina doesn't pay her to give lectures on diversity. If Dawn Staley truly believed in diversity, you know what that would get her? Fired. But let me give you another example of how diversity can ruin an organization. Last night, we get home probably around 8 o'clock from having dinner with my parents. Pull up the Bally Sports app to watch Pelicans Thunder. I knew the game was already on ESPN, but I wanted to watch on Bally so I could start it from the beginning and watch it through the end. Plus, I just absolutely hate ESPN's coverage of the NBA. It is Awful, awful. I prefer to listen to Joel Myers and Antonio Daniels call the game over anyone at ESPN. But I go to pull up the Bally app, and once again, Bally is having technical difficulties. I was able to get it working at the start of the fourth quarter, but I was forced to watch the third quarter on ESPN. Now, on the court, you couldn't have asked for a more exciting third quarter. Pelicans came back from a 22-point deficit, ended up winning the game. As a fan, the game was exciting, but watching that game on ESPN, it had a different feeling to it. Why? Because the broadcast team absolutely sucked. I mean, it was some of the worst broadcasting that I've ever heard. They literally sucked the energy out of that arena. When the third quarter ended, my girlfriend, she looked over at me and said, "Can we please try to get Bally working again? I can't even get into this game because these announcers are ruining it for me." We tried Bally again, and thankfully it worked. But I knew from his voice that the insufferable Mark Jones was calling this game. But there was also a woman who was trying to call it. I had never heard her before. She was painfully boring. I mean, painfully boring. There was no excitement in her voice. Her voice was completely monotone throughout the game. To make things worse, she knew absolutely nothing about either of the teams and knew nothing about the NBA. I had to look her up. Her name is Monica McNutt. ESPN describes her as an NBA analyst. Translation: she's another Mina Kimes. Monica never played in the WNBA. She damn sure never played in the NBA. So why in the hell is she the analyst during a live broadcast of an NBA game? Diversity. Monica met the only two requirements needed to get this job at ESPN. Female, check. Woman of color, check. Hired. At ESPN, that's all that matters. I know I have been spoiled for years with Joel Myers and Antonio Daniels. I mean, they're the best in the business, but I don't feel like I'm asking for much when the Pelicans are on ESPN. Just give me competence. Just give me broadcasters who know how to broadcast the game. Instead, ESPN, they give me diversity. They give me equity. Two things I don't give a shit about, especially when I'm watching the NBA. But give me your thoughts. Elle Duncan humiliates herself on live television. She claims to know about women's sports, and she doesn't know shit about women's sports. Am I the only one that finds it ironic that Dawn Staley practices against men? Dawn Staley supposedly is all about girl power. She's all about diversity. Until it comes down to winning. Then Dawn Staley only cares about winning at all cost. You know, ESPN has fallen so far. Here we have Elle Duncan getting busted for being a fraud with her lack of knowledge on women's sports. Give me your thoughts on this. Sound off in the comments below. Like, subscribe, share the video. I appreciate you guys and your continued support. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys later.